welcome all to the weekly Fireside Chat, the New York Information Security Meetup slash the Cyber Guild. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Ronnie Tokazowski, right? Hopefully I pronounced it correctly as much as I could.
Mm-hmm. Ronnie, he works too. So
yeah, who's a senior threat researcher, at Agari currently, but obviously you've done quite a bit in this space. So welcome. So what I'd like to do, this is completely unscripted and just the way I like it. So first of all, let me just say, I love your background. It looks like you've been busy, including some hardware type of I see some devices here and so on, including that cool mask that's iconic. So why don't we get started and just like kind of give us an idea, the background of how you got to where you are today. What made you become a researcher, and what does it entail?
Yeah, I can go ahead and talk through that. Yeah. My name is Ronnie Tokazowski, senior threat researcher at Agari. My quest really kind of started back in like middle school. I would say probably when I was like 13 or so. Growing up, I grew up on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. We didn't really have much of anything. Growing up, we were really poor. So just by design, I was someone who was very frugal on things. I always liked hacking things to try and put them together to see if I can make them work as good as they could. So growing up, we never really had a computer until I was about 13 years old. And that was when this whole information security thing started. So around that time, I was playing with a bunch of codes and scripts and everything, like little things where you could kick friends off the line and everything. So I was playing with one of those tools, and someone messaged me over AOL Messenger, it was AIM at the time, and sent me my password. And I'm like, what? He said, that's your password. And I'm like, no, it's not. So I went to go change my password really quick. But that was the first exposure to somebody hacking my account and everything. At that point, I'm like, I want to do that. That's kind of cool. So that's kind of what started this whole quest, if you will, of learning how computers work, learning information security, being able to take them apart.
Yeah. So Ronnie, quick question. Did you find out why and how?
So I eventually figured out the why and the how and everything. So it was one of the programs I had downloaded actually had a Trojan in it. So the Trojan actually was stealing the passwords and everything. So he had got my password that way. Fast forward to actually a year ago. So almost 20 years later, I actually found the guy. And I messaged him. I'm like, hey, was this you by chance? Because I remember the name he used. He's like, oh my God, that's a blast to the past. So 20 years later, I found the guy who hacked 13-year-old me, who got this whole thing started. So I told him, I'm like, yeah, I'm a security researcher. I do this stuff.
No way. That's amazing.
Yeah. And what it was he had used the same account on Reddit. So it was Reddit where I ended up tracking him back and everything. I'm like, are you this guy? He's like, and it turned out to be, it was the
20
same guy.
years later.
20 years later. And it all came down to reusing the same handle. So I eventually called him. So
yeah. So what does that tell you? Right. So people are, I mean, it's like, old habits die hard, right?
Exactly.
Must have been using it for a while. That is amazing. So I guess, you can did you thank him for doing that and maybe like kind of diverting you into that path?
I did, yeah. I told him, I'm like, yeah, you don't realize what you opened, but here you go. So I gave him my information and whatnot, because at that point, that information was hopefully sealed. I haven't used that password since that time, because somebody popped my password. But yeah, that's what really started getting me interested in like the offensive side of things, into working with computers, doing tech work, removing viruses off of computers and all that. And that's really what kind of got my interest going in it.
So in the early days, right, you were young, and then, did you go to school and study that, or how, how did you actually take that from like a kind of a hobby, being in North Carolina and doing that, to actual profession?
Yeah. So I started there on the Outer Banks and everything, and I graduated high school. And once I graduated, I knew I wanted to do something with computers. So I went to university to get a degree in computer science, eventually graduated with that and everything. And one of the things I got to do for my last for an internship was I was a resident technician on campus. So I was helping fix computers for the students who were there. So for my last internship, I got free right to actually hack the campus. So I went and I did a penetration test. I reported everything back. I had got, now that is all up, I can now talk about what I got. So I had gotten into all of the phone systems because of how the passwords were set. I think it was like 70% of the boxes I had access to. I had gotten root access on the computers, so I could have used that root password to install malware on the computers. And the cream of the crop, I had one guy who was he was like, "You're never gonna get in. You're never gonna get in." And I eventually handed him a password that had it was a password for the firewall. I'm like, "Do you need this?" He's like, "Wait, how did you get this?" And he started getting all flustered and whatnot. And it was something where it really kind of hit that, hey, this wasn't just some random barefoot computer guy who walks around campus in bare feet and pajamas, who still walks around barefoot in pajamas. Is like, this isn't this average schmuck and everything. And that's what I did, was I handed him the password and everything, and he got all pissed off with me and everything. I'm like, it's not my default it's not my password for the campus firewall that I have on here. I mean, like, you may want to go change this. And that was a cool thing, was through that internship, I was able to see both the offensive side of it and figure out how to work with people to start fixing that. So just like working with a regular penetration test, I wrote everything up and said, here's how I was able to get in, here's how I was able to break all these things, and here's how I was able to fix, and here's how they should be fixed and stuff.
And quick question, Ronnie. So we share. I have a computer science degree as well, and I remember like taking these classes, and they teach you like programming languages, algorithms, math. There's a lot of math and so on, but they don't actually teach you. At least when I went to school, they don't actually teach you hacking.
That's right.
And I'm assuming, because you took it a little while back, I'm assuming that was the case as well for you. So how did you go from like, being classes that are kind of general computer science to be able to know, how to kind of quote unquote hack into computers and find vulnerabilities?
So for me, it was a combination of personal interest and a professor who saw me getting bored. And it was something where going through JavaScript, going through writing C and C++, I hated it. It was so dry. It was so mundane. You would go and write a program in like 30 lines of JavaScript. And I was that guy where I'm like, no, I can write it in 4 in Perl. So my professor one of my professors, actually a business professor, who realized it, but he had an interest in the computer science side. So he's like, let me help you out and everything. So he helped show me the ways of coding languages. He was the one who actually helped me get the internship, and he was a mentor for me on that and everything. And he really kind of helped point me that direction. Like, okay, he's like, okay, you're doing this stuff, keep going this way. And because there is that career path there. Because unfortunately, the university I went to, all we had was computer science, and there was only like 10 kids in the department. So it was something where computer science wasn't the main thing on campus. So I really had to kind of hack my way, if you will, to getting the thing I need. And that professor really helped me along the way on that.
And the reason I asked this question, because, I always tell people it's such a vast area, in cybersecurity. There's a lot of different components to it. And a lot of people are just not aware that some of these, disciplines even exist.
Yeah.
People don't know necessarily they can go out and become, a researcher, right? They just, I can become a programmer. You can do tech support. You can be an analyst and so on. But, being a researcher is not something that's completely clear. So it's really interesting that you got that guidance from somebody who's actually was in the business section of things and not computers. So fast forward to after that, what was your kind of your first quote unquote real job after the internship?
Yeah, so I'll come back to that, but I want to kind of touch back on one point that you mentioned too, because it's super important. And I get this question all the time. So I have a lot of people who will come to me and they'll ask, Ronnie, like, how do I become a researcher and everything? And it's something where you nailed it, David. It's something where most people don't realize that there are other avenues out there other than just being a security researcher. It's like and most of the people are like, oh, I want to go hacking and do pen testing. But I'm like, there's blue teaming, there's server development, there's infrastructure, your email infrastructure, application, web pen testing and stuff. There are so many different avenues of that quote unquote infosec bucket that most people don't even realize are part of that. So it's something where if you get into a
and by the way, Ronnie, 100%, I agree. No, I 100%, and not even that, because of the fast, how fast pace of industry. There are people today that do, automobile hacking, vehicle. That wasn't even around like when we graduated.
Oh. Yeah, and at that point, the only electronics that were in cars were you had embedded ROM chips. And the only car hacking that was really going on wasn't necessarily the security people who were looking to hack it. The car hacking that we saw back in the day was these people who wanted to take those ROM chips out of that car and see how much they could tweak it to tweak the fuel injection
That's right.
in order to optimize the speed and performance of their car. So if you actually look at the roots of car hacking, that's where it came from. It came from a lot of the motorheads just wanting to make their cars go faster. And it was something where early on, I was actually approached by somebody. I'm like, I don't do embedded stuff, but it's something where people just want to make their cars go faster. And that was like the beginnings of car hacking.
Yeah. But that's completely unclear to most people. And then again, in 2 years from now, there's going to be, hacking of like, medical devices that wasn't even around. There's just so much of that, wearables. I mean, you name it. Everything's becoming computerized. So you did that. You kind of hacked the campus.
Yep.
And then did you have that on your resume saying, hey, I managed to hack the infrastructure of the campus and I pissed a lot of people off and now you should hire me? Is that what you had? Is that how you got the first job?
Pretty much. So it was a combination of that. It was a combination of having a friend at the company who I actually met through IRC. He is the one who actually helped get me my referral to my first job. And it was for a defense contractor in the DC area. So while I was there, that was what really kind of sped up my exposure to information security, if you will. I joke that in the 3 years I was there, it was like 10 years of experience with all the things that we got exposed to. So I was responding to APT incidents. I was reversing APT malware. A lot of the Chinese state-sponsored stuff at the time, things like your comment crew, your WECBs, your UPSs, PRPs, and things like that. So that was why I started reversing when it came to malware samples. And through there, I also learned a lot of the forensic side too, such as the things where, okay, a scammer will write to this directory or they like to write to that directory, and that's how they operate. So trying to learn those pieces as well to understand how that infrastructure and how those attacks and how that type of engagement works, and as well as what you have to do in order to protect an organization and the things that you have to do. So it was something where that was really my first exposure to a lot of these things of information security, how to do and protect it, how to do these things and how to protect an organization. And it was, even to this day, there's groups that I've analyzed from back there that have never been made public. But it's interesting seeing things unfold and seeing groups that were either worked on or documented back then coming back out, and that stuff still being practical today.
And Ronnie, this is great because we uncover another point which I think is worth emphasizing. So your first job was like you had 3 years, but it was almost like dog years, like in terms of the amount of stuff that you did and the things you were exposed. And I always recommend to people starting out, if all possible, choose a job that will expose you to all of that. And typically that happens in smaller companies where your roles are not as defined and you can do like a bunch of stuff and advance quickly. And again, this really allow you to expand and get like that base knowledge of all the things you needed to do. And then also I think define what you like and what you don't like. Right. I'm assuming that all the things you've done, I'm assuming that there were some things that you enjoyed more doing, but we were exposed to it pretty quick. So, just for kind of like, and if you don't mind, let's kind of talk a bit about what does that mean to reverse engineer something, right? Because it's not clear. I think a lot of people, it's just, this stuff is a bit of an enigma. Yeah. And how do you approach something like that? And, what was your first, malware, and maybe even define malware? What is the definition of malware, and how has that advanced through the years, and how do you kind of go ahead and reverse something like that?
Yeah, so I will start with like defining what reverse engineering is, and it's something where it's less of a thing you do, but more of a way you look at things through life. And again, that's probably a really weird analogy of saying it, but like, for example, I love cooking. So for me, I'm someone that I like to take a recipe, I like to tweak it, I like to modify it in order to make it better. So what I'll do is I'll taste that ingredient or I'll taste that spice. Okay, there's salt, there's brown sugar, paprika, add a little bit in there to see how the recipe is, tweak that a little bit, come back and do that and whatnot. So and if you ask any reverse engineer, the definition is going to be different for each person. But for me, the way I define a reverse engineer is someone who can take something apart and understand it well enough to where they can recreate it on their own or recreate something similar or better. That's usually what's involved in reverse engineering, of actually understanding something to that level. So in the context of what is malware, malware is something that I'll define what malware isn't. So for example, you go and you install Skype on your computer. That's a legitimate application to do legitimate things, and you use it to chat back and forth. You have things like Google Chrome, where Chrome will go and you use it to browse the web. And in and of itself, that function of I'm downloading a web browser to browse the web, that's what it's for. What malware is it goes outside of that area, and it usually has some malicious intent behind it. So for example, it could be a keylogger that's logging keystrokes on your computer, that those keystrokes are going back to an attacker. It could be something where it's trying to take pictures of your camera in order to try and hit you with sextortion or things like that. So malware in and of itself is usually like a regular program, but it's something that has malicious intent. And it's something where a lot of it has to come down to what the intent is. You have other definitions of malware, such as like remote access Trojans. You have ransomware that gets thrown in there. I would even argue that things like scareware would be a form of malware. But you've also got other things too, where there are scams that happen that are still malicious, but isn't a single file. So those things like such as BEC and everything, if you will, that it doesn't have malware related to it, but it still has the similar intent of trying to cause harm. So usually with defining malware, it's something that tries to cause harm. So then to answer, okay, now that you know that reverse engineering is taking something apart to where you understand all the pieces of it, and this malware is something that's bad, how do you actually put the two together and reverse malware? And what does that look like? So the glorified answer and the easiest answer is you double click it and you see where it goes. You double click it and you run it and you see what website does it try to call out to? What does it actually do? And that's a difference of dynamic analysis being I double clicked it, or static analysis being I'm looking at the code. So in terms of dynamic analysis, it's something where you're just trying to see where it goes, where it runs, so that you could take that domain or that registry key or that thing and put that into your security tools to protect your organization or to protect your customers. So on the root, that's the basic analysis that reverse engineers are trying to do, and that quick dynamic analysis usually falls under malware analysis. For reverse engineering, that usually goes that extra layer deep, and that usually looks at trying to say, okay, we have this malicious file. This malicious file is using an encoded payload, and we don't know what that is, but we know that there are commands being sent out of that. So your reverse engineer will look at the code, study those bits, study that information in order to figure out how can I take that apart and actually figure out what that encoding piece does. So once you figure out that encoding piece, that's usually where you go that extra layer and actually try to reverse engineer exactly what's happening. So I know that was a little bit longer of an explanation, but hopefully that demystifies some of the things of, this super secret stuff in assembly. It's like, no, 90% of malware analysis is double clicking the damn thing and running strings on a memory dump. So, but no other RE, but most REs won't admit that, but that's really what it is. So.
Well, you make it sound so simple. So what about software that basically, collects a little bit too much information? So it's not necessarily, malicious, but they might be collecting, data that's not necessarily applicable to what the software does. For example, like you download something to your phone and it start collecting your contact information, despite the fact that there's no need for the contact information. Yep. So what are your thoughts about that, and how do you potentially protect yourself from something like that?
So with stuff like that now comes into a completely different thing of looking at intent. So let's say that let's see, what would be a good example? So let's say Microsoft downloads information about your system. And you go when it does that, it does it when your computer crashes. So at the time when your computer crashes, it will go and collect all the information. But the underlying intent is not necessarily to collect that and then sell that, The underlying intent is to try and understand what happened on your system at that point, so the Microsoft can recreate it and protect their customers. So that collection of data wouldn't be malicious. Let's go ahead and poke a nice big bear, such as Facebook. So for them, I know they've been under a lot of scrutiny when it comes to privacy laws and everything. And for free services such as Facebook, such as Google, such as Instagram, such as a lot of these other, such as Twitter, such as a lot of places like this, you're the product at that point. So it's something where by using that free service, you're now generating profit for that company. And it's not something directly where you see that. It's something where a lot of times that comes in as ad revenue. And I forget what, it was one of the last things I saw from Google, but something like 70% of all of their revenue is from ads. So it's something where at that point, you now become that product. And Dave, with what you were saying with collecting of the information, that's where a lot of that information may go. In order to try and build queries and information about you in order to sell you something. So it's something where that gets into a whole nother thing of ad services and whether we should be able to do that or not. But a lot of collections like that, that's usually what happens. You also have cases where it can be used for nefarious purposes too, or such as like Cambridge Analytica, where that information was compiled into one aggregate form. And then from there, that information was used to try to understand your likes and dislikes as from the political sense, in order to say, okay, people in this group will tend to gravitate towards this thing, push them that way. People over here like this, push them that way, and kind of balloon out from there.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. I think that specifically, people are not aware as well of some of the complexities, and you probably back me up on that. But
yeah,
applications today, they're sometimes combined. It's not just one code. Like they combine like maybe 10 different APIs, that basically do calls to other services. Mm-hmm. So does that make any difference from your perspective in terms of in trying to investigate what the app does? Because now it's the application itself might be containing various other different codes. Mm-hmm. Would that make a difference to you, like in terms of the intent, in terms of like what the application collects?
Yeah, it really does. Because again, if it's something where, like, take Google, for example, if I go and do a search for something on my phone and I search for, let's say, a quadcopter part, my ads on Facebook from that Google search are going to pop up quadcopter parts. It happens. We know that it happens. It's creepy as all get out, but it's something where it happens. So yeah, it's very much through that API feed of data and marketing, if you will, that gets from that. I did a search on a thing from my Google phone in order to go back to that ad that's now popping up on Facebook. So yeah, it's something where all those APIs that happen are a way to funnel your views into buying something, if you will, in order to make money off of you. Mm-hmm. And again, it kind of goes back to with those free services, such as Facebook, such as Google and all them, you're the product. So you make them money by generating ad revenue and clicking and buying things.
Now, your day-to-day job, like, so Agari I believe mainly works with enterprise, right? Mm-hmm. So, what it is that you do for them, and why is Agari interested in malware specifically?
So I will say that we actually don't do a lot with malware. And it's interesting, like, because my handle is iHeartMalware, but once I came here, I'm putting that reversing hat on the shelf. So for my day-to-day job and what I've been doing over the last 5 years is I focus on an area of crime known as business email compromise. And what that is initially started as something simple. It's usually where scammers will say, hey, are you in the office? Are you on desk? Can you do an urgent wire transfer for me? So from that, and that's kind of how my stuff started in that regard. For here at Agari, one of the things we do is we engage directly with the scammers. So we try and get different information out of them. We try and get different bank accounts out of them. And we will impersonate a victim and say, hey, yes, I'm a victim, but we will go ahead and we'll do that urgent wire transfer for you. We'll go and do that gift card transfer for you. And the reason that we do that is because we gain a ton of insight into how these scams work, and we gain a ton of intelligence just in how the whole scheme works. It's something where 5 years ago I would have said business email compromise is its own thing. But if you told me back then that we were going to find romance victims that were related to this, if you told me that check fraud, voodoo, money laundering, blood sacrifices, human trafficking was all going to be related to this stuff, I would have said you were absolutely nuts. I would have said that if I'd be defending people in Nigeria because of the stuff that they're doing, I would have said you were absolutely nuts. But unfortunately, this is just the way this stuff works. And it's what really sucks with business email compromise. It's so complex and so elaborate that what we're fighting right now isn't something that just popped up 5 years ago. We're fighting 30 years of 419 fraud. That BEC is just a symptom right now of what we initially fought all those years ago. So I'm happy to I know that's how you initially reached out to me. I told you I could seriously ramble for like 2 hours straight.
No, but
about
no,
BEC.
Ronnie. But here's the thing: my mind just exploded now because you open up so many. Like I just wish I could dive into every single rabbit hole that you actually open up now. So
which one do you want first? You want romance?
I don't know. I don't know. There's just so many of them. I
got dead grandmothers too. If you want that, where Yahoo boys will actually sacrifice their grandmothers. So
why don't we pick one that is just people can remember, and tomorrow they're gonna say, hey, I watched Ronnie was talking about dead grandmothers. So why don't we pick one that is cool and interesting, and maybe that's not completely mainstream that people know about.
Okay, so I've got my bottle right here. Let's start talking. Let's start talking about romance victims, because that is seriously some of the most depressing stuff that I have ever seen. And I will say that when I initially started this whole quest in BEC, I never, ever, ever thought I was going to be dabbling with romance victims. But unfortunately, they're like the key thing in this whole BEC thing. So the way that romance scams work, and actually, I forget if it was a Tennessee whiskey. Yes. So it was a honey whiskey I had, but it was
that's a good one.
But I actually had like several other bottles and everything too, and this was like my catch-all. I think there's like some rum in there and some other stuff, so it's like a mixture of stuff. But yeah, no, it's nice golden honey whiskey and stuff.
So what did you find what that scam is? For people who are not familiar with, and then maybe kind of walk us through, some of your encounters with some of these scammers.
Yep. Yeah, so with romance scams, the way that those work, a lot of people, if you start doing research on it, it goes under multiple names. So one of the names it would go under is confidence fraud is something that it goes under. It goes under e-whoring, or one of the most popular ways that people know it is they know it as catfishing. And the way it works is people who are trying to date will go on a dating website. plentyoffish.com, singles dating, Christian singles dating, Christian mingle, farmers dating, HIV positive dating.com. They will go to any of those dating websites, and they'll go and make a profile, fill out information about who they are, and go and try and find a relationship. And a lot of the times, the people who are going to find a relationship fall into the category of either single, divorced, or widowed, because if you were together with somebody, you probably wouldn't be going looking for a relationship. So as these people go on these dating profiles, they'll get responses and inquiries back saying, hey, let's talk. Let's try and get more information about you and everything. So obviously pictures will be sent back and forth. You may have one person that will send the person who's going to date pictures and everything. They may be like, hey, I'm here in France. I really love it here. I've been traveling. I love to travel. I like wine, or I like flying as well. So they'll go ahead and they'll be like, okay, let's take that conversation offline. Let's start talking over like texting or Facebook. So that those conversations will then be brought over off of that platform to other means. And it's usually because there's a cost associated with talking on the platform. And it's usually maybe 10 cents or so per message, but it's to help make it cheaper to keep talking. So over this time, those people will go and build a relationship with the person they're talking with. They may take pictures of their food and send it, just like we all do, and we post on social media. We'll go and talk about desires of what we want to do, of where we want to go and live in this exotic place. The other person on the other end may say the same thing of, oh, I can't wait till we're together. And that's where the first question comes up, of where I'm in a really bad situation and I need you to help me out. I'm stuck here, or I have this inheritance thing that's trying to go through, and I need you to go ahead and pay money for that. Excuse me. Or I need you to help pay for that. And as quickly as I just explained that, and as seamless as I expanded that, that's how easy it is for these people to become romance victims. So it's something where it's not just somebody who doesn't realize what they're doing is wrong. It's something where that's how seamless this is to that person. The romance scams and the person they're speaking with actually looks like a real person. And what the scammers will do is they will go and collect all these images. So they may have 30 images that they can use in order to send back to that victim to say, yes, I am who I say I am and everything. They also have what they call scripts and formats, which are a large body of text that they can copy paste back and forth to that victim. And in many cases, they're very loving. And they may say something like, hey, I'm single and divorced with 3 kids. I'm just looking for more. I'm just looking to spend the rest of my life with somebody, and they're very convincing for a lot of the victims. And once they go ahead and they start doing that, and once they start taking money from that victim, they will start using them for other things too. So initially, it starts out very small. It may start with like a couple $100 here and there. But as time goes on, the victim starts to trust that scammer even more. So for that scammer, they're able to start getting more money outside of that victim. And a lot of times, and I've seen cases where people have sent their entire inheritance. People have had to get their homes foreclosed on just because they were trying to bring that person they were actually in love with back over. And to these victims, they actually think they're in a relationship. They actually think they're in this relationship, which really, really sucks.
Without actually meeting the person ever, right? This
correct.
is all remote. Wow,
Yeah,
that's unbelievable.
Yeah, so again, it's all remote, but also from the perspective of that victim, they're seeing all these pictures that have been sent over to them. So to them, they have somebody talking with them on the other end. They can show you a picture and say, hey, here's the person I'm dating. So much so that we actually had one victim. It was our group that we called Exaggerated Lion that we were looking at. And for him, when we found him, he had gotten arrested in Beaumont, Texas, and he was arrested for laundering $100,000 over 2.5 years. And when you look at it, he had one of the groups that he hit was United Methodist Church. And it's like, on the cuff, that sounds absolutely horrible. However, through our data collection and through our analysis, we actually had the chatter for how that unfolded from the scammer's perspective. So with the scammer, he was actually telling the victim that he needs to go ahead and send money for the inheritance. And so the entire time, the victim thought he was trying to cash money for Peggy's inheritance. But on the other side, it was actually a scammer. So there was actually even one case where the scammer had, and this is where it now gets tied into the BEC thing and kind of where romance victims now play into this role. On the other side, the scammer had actually ran another victim organization in order to send a check to the victim over here. So that check from one state got sent to a second state with a second mule. That mule then sent the check over here to this person who the check was in his name. So now at this point, that check has crossed 2 different borders in order to get to this person. That mule went to put that check into the bank account and sat on it for 10 days and everything because the bank had to verifying let the data clear. After that 10 days, it went through one more day of checks and everything before it finally cleared. To the bank's perspective, the check was 100% legitimate. It was actually a real check from this company, and this company actually thought they were paying this vendor. And again, this happened in this BEC exchange up here, but your romance mule was the one who actually got the check. So once that romance mule actually had the money, the scammer told them, hey, go put this, go take that $15,000 cash, deposit that into a Bitcoin ATM. He didn't because his truck wasn't running well. He was watching a friend of his, and the only one was 2.5 hours away. He says, is there any other way? So what that victim did was he put $15,000 cash in a FedEx box, shipped that to another victim in Rogers, Arkansas.
No way.
And then from there, it was gone. But again, through the entire exchange with the victim, he thought he was in a relationship. He thought it was for a lawyer fee associated with Peggy's inheritance. And like so much so that he would take pictures of his food and send it to the victim, or send it to the scammer. There were even exchanges where he said, yeah, the cops came, and the victim said, oh, don't worry about them, they're fake and everything. So even throughout this time, the victims are being groomed in order to do this laundering of money, and they have no idea what they're doing. So when you actually look at the BEC chain and kind of taking that step back, and why I always look at romance victims, or why I like looking at romance victims in this regard, is almost one-to-one. Whenever you see a bank account in a BEC attack, that account ties back to a romance victim. So the way that BEC actors use those romance victims is they will say, hey, you're going to be receiving this wire for $35,000. Wire it to this account over here, or pull it out of the bank account and send it in as cash over here. And by adding those layers of obfuscation to each step, it becomes very, very difficult to actually track that. Because if it was something where if it was just like bank accounts going back and forth, it's like, okay, give it to the bank. But the problem is there are so many layers that end up getting split that chasing that train becomes extremely difficult. And not only is it difficult, but then you now have jurisdiction of, okay, this check and now $15,000 cash now passed four different state lines. I'm like, is the victim the person that was the one who sent the check? Is the one who helped it was the one that actually sent it back to the romance mule? What is the romance mule a victim, or are they someone who actually should be held accountable for and arrested for this? But when you actually look at the victim, there is much of a victim as the person up here. So now it becomes a problem of trying to not only figure jurisdiction who the victim is, but trying to realize, okay, this touched four different states for this one $15,000 thing, but there's limits that you can go ahead and actually work that from law enforcement perspective. And again, this stuff gets so convoluted and there's so many overlapping pieces that it becomes extremely difficult to actually identify and dig in and understand all of these pieces to actually do something with it, if that makes sense.
Totally, Ronnie. I think this was one of the most remarkable conversation I've had on this particular podcast. It's really unbelievable, and it's so complicated. It really is. They're trying to follow you in terms of what happens, and so if it's, and you're a researcher, right? We do this on a regular basis. I can't imagine somebody who's completely unaware that kind of gets sucked into something like this. No wonder they're completely lost. So are they typically, these people are on the hook for money laundering, in terms of law enforcement? And do you typically provide like expert witness when they call you in to some larger, transactions and so on? What does that process look like from your perspective?
So for that process, I really try to have a hands-off approach with a lot of the victims, just because I'm not a law enforcement officer. But I do a lot of work with law enforcement in order to kind of get ahead of this stuff, because it's like at the end of the day, they're the ones who can put the cuffs on people. We do the analysis, and we have to all collaborate together to actually make a difference in this. So for actually like being an expert witness, I haven't done that before. And again, the thing that really sucks on this is that a lot of the laws are still trying to play catch up, and a lot of what's actually happening is a level of psychological manipulation, psychological abuse. So it's something where you also have cases of Stockholm syndrome, where people are now being emotionally abused into being a victim. Because again, if you look at some of the chats, everything, it's actually gone the extent of emotional abuse for some of these people who are now in this. So it's something where, yes, you can arrest them, but it doesn't actually fix the underlying problem. The other thing too, and again, this is the only analogy I've been able to come up with to actually articulate this. But with these victims, they actually think they've been in a relationship for this entire time. So they actually feel like that as it goes on, they feel like I'm in love with this person. I've had this 2.5-year relationship. I've seen romance victims going up to 10 years in some cases for this stuff too. So when you approach them, and when you actually go and try and talk with them, it's something where you're now telling them that everything that they know in their head over the last 2.5 years for that relationship is complete false. So just think of like from their perspective on that. Okay, now everything that I
devastating.
It's devastating.
Mentally.
And a lot of those things where if you actually start looking back at human psychology, it now becomes a coping mechanism for extreme and abusive situations where, to that person who's had that level of abuse and everything, your body starts to cope and realize, okay, no, I wasn't in this one. I wasn't that victim. This couldn't have happened to me. So unfortunately, a lot of cases, even when the victims are approached, they tend to stay in this thing because, again, it's that detrimental on that. And again, the only analogy I can think of that I've been able to come up with is essentially you're trying to rip like a chunk out of their head to say, no, everything that you have done, that piece of that relationship right there, that's wrong. That was not a real relationship. So everything around that is now false. And it's something where everything they thought was going true, but it's now the complete opposite and everything. So it becomes a really bad cycle for them. And again, these are like areas of psychology that we're just now beginning to understand that's how deep this stuff goes, of trying to entrench that person in order to keep sending this stuff. And again, that's why I fight so hard for this stuff, is because a lot of these victims don't realize it. They don't understand that level of abuse going into this. And it's something where people just shouldn't have to be doing that and everything. And when you actually look at what's going on in Nigeria, and this will probably be a segue into the next section, many of the scammers actually see this as a game. They see this as a game of wit, to where if they can trick you out of that money, it's free game. They're entitled to that money.
Ronnie, I would have to make this a two-part series because I don't want to stop. Seriously, I want to stop here. Because we run out of time. Mm-hmm. And then what I want to do is schedule another session, maybe like same time next week or something like that. And then I would like to start diving into Nigeria and some other stuff that you're working on. Because it's just, again, it blows my mind, and I don't want to stop here. I want to make sure that we continue. So this has been unbelievable. Again, I think that people are not aware of how sophisticated some of these are. And also the consequences, like, what is at stake here? It's not just bits and bytes. You're talking about people's lives here. So I think that's something that people are not completely aware. I think people hear scam, they say, okay, you got scammed from $1,000, $2,000. My credit card got charged $500. The credit card company, pays me back. But some of these people have their whole life ruined, right? Mm-hmm. And then, as you mentioned, the adversaries, hackers think it's a game. Right. Yeah. So on their side. Okay, good. So why don't we stop here? I'll, if just kind of so people to find you, what's the best way to reach you?
I would say shoot me. I'm on Twitter under the handle of iHeartMalware. And just also one more thing, just to help close out the romance side and everything, so that one will be absolutely done. Looking at BEC and romance scams, ignoring your romance victims would be the same as ignoring an IP address associated with a malware sample. It's like the romance victims are the infrastructure of BEC attack, and they're the underlying piece that's moving a lot of the stuff. So you actually can't ignore that. It's something where you gotta know that too and everything.
Absolutely incredible, Ronnie. It's been a real pleasure having you. So let's do again. This was part one. Mm-hmm. We'll schedule another one, part two. We can dive in deeper into this, and then let's see what we can get to next time. So thank you all for joining, and I appreciate. Looking forward to seeing you hopefully next week. Yep. Ronnie, thank you again for joining, and thanks for spending the time. And it was very insightful. Absolutely amazing. Thanks for again.